Hey y'all, welcome back to Feasting on the Word, and I am DG Hamblin, and like I told you in the last video that I would go over the story of David and Goliath, we're going to spend a lot more time on David because the things that lead up to Goliath are important, and hopefully I can correct some misconceptions because as I studied this, I've discovered some really cool things, and there's some true misconceptions out there. Malcolm Gladwell, if you know who he is, he did this whole video on some of the issues he had with the story, and he just absolutely gets some of it wrong. Anyway, but so we're going to start here. A little bit of background. Samuel, the prophet, has been sent to Bethlehem to meet with Jesse to anoint one of Jesse's sons as king. Now, one of the problems with coming into a town is that sometimes the prophet showed up and it was not good news, and it was always big news. And so Samuel's afraid that it's going to get back to Saul, that he came to Bethlehem and Saul's going to wonder what's going on. And so the Lord says, we'll go and call Jesse and his sons to a feast and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so he comes into town. We're in 1 Samuel 16. So if you have your Bible, just flip open there. So Samuel in verse 4, he did what the Lord tells him. He comes to town, and the elders of the town trembled because when the prophet showed up, it was not always good news. Sometimes it was a bad thing. So they're afraid that maybe something bad somebody has done some terrible thing and the prophet has come to. There's going to be an issue. But anyway, he says, no, peaceably I'm come, verse 5. Peaceably I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. So he calls Jesse and Jesse's sons to come to this sacrifice. Now, something to remember here is that Jesse is the grandson of Boaz. And Boaz himself was quite wealthy, but he had married Ruth and had then provided, through Ruth, provided posterity for Ruth's husband, and Ruth. So Ruth and Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, would have a way to live. But as it relates to this story, the important thing there is that Naomi's husband, he probably owned land here in or around Bethlehem, and that land would have then gone to Ruth's sons. And so Jesse here is very likely, he's one of these elders, almost certainly, and there's a good chance that he may have been even the most important person, or considered most important, there in Bethlehem. So he would have had a man of no small means. He would have had land and some, I want to say money, but he was kind of upper middle class or upper, not rich. I'm not describing it well. Anyway, he probably had some servants. These were not poor people. Put it that way. Okay, enough talking. Let's get on. Okay, so he calls Jesse and his sons to the sacrifice. Now, he's going to anoint this king before they eat. They're going to have a meal. And so here are the sons. And it came to pass when they were come, he looked upon Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. And the Lord says, don't look on his countenance. Look in verse 7. Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature. In other words, don't see what he looks like. Look how tall he is. Now this tells me that Eliab must have been pretty tall. We know Saul was very tall. This is described as head and shoulders taller than anybody else. Well, if average height back then was 5'6", that would put Saul about 6'6". Really tall and big for that time. But Eliab also was not a small person, apparently. And that's going to come to play here in a few minutes. Okay, he says a little further down in verse 7, the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. That famous scripture that we have all heard. And so then Abinadab, probably the second oldest, he comes, and this isn't the right one, and Shema, and if I'm saying these names wrong, I'm sorry. Anyway, so 7 of his sons all passed before Samuel, and none of these are chosen to be the king. And so Samuel asks Jesse in verse 11, are here all thy children? So he was supposed to call all the sons to the sacrifice, right? And he says, there remaineth yet the youngest, he keepeth the sheep. So the youngest is keeping the sheep. And Samuel says, send and fetch him. We will not sit down till he comes hither. So we're not going to eat until he's here. Now, the question that I have that came to me one day as I'm reading this is, why is David not there? He's supposed to call all of the sons. Okay, and I think there's a few clues we're going to see here as to why he wasn't called. The first one is where it says he's the youngest. Okay, the word here in Hebrew for youngest is katan. And that can mean the youngest, but it can also mean small. It can mean insignificant or unimportant. And I think that's the real message here. It's like, yeah, but he doesn't count. He's not important. Now, he may have been the youngest, but he may not have been the youngest. Because of the way that this word works here, I don't really know. There might be someone who's a better scholar of Hebrew than I am who might say, no, I'm wrong, and I might be wrong. He could be the youngest, but there's another reason why he is so unimportant. Now, think about this, okay? As I mentioned that Jesse was probably wealthy. They would have been able to afford servants to watch over the sheep. In fact, we'll read later that David, when he goes to visit the army, that he leaves the sheep with a keeper. So he leaves them with somebody whose job is to watch the sheep. Why is David doing servant's work? Some would say, well, that's how they did it, when the youngest kept the sheep. Well, maybe, but it wasn't like that. When did it become that way? Because it wasn't that way with Jacob, with Israel, and with Joseph, who was the youngest. He stayed behind while all the other brothers were out with the flocks. And they probably weren't necessarily watching them. They were there kind of overseeing the servants who would have been keeping them. So why is he? Why are they making him do it? All right. So they call him in. Now here's a description of David, and they don't give a detailed description of the others, and I think there's a reason why they give a detailed description of David. Verse 12, he sent and brought him in. Now, he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. So that maybe that doesn't really stand out until you start reading what this stuff means. So, ruddy. Well, I would be called ruddy. I have a fair complexion. I turn pink easily. You can't tell anymore, but I used to have red hair. Now, he probably didn't have a complexion exactly like mine, but he likely had a more fair complexion than his brothers. And his hair was probably a different color. Otherwise, I don't think that they would bother describing him as ruddy when they don't describe anybody else as being that way. Additionally, it says, withal of a beautiful countenance. Okay, not a great translation here. We see beautiful countenance as a descriptor a few times here in the Old Testament. But in this instance, beautiful countenance comes from a Hebrew phrase, Yafeh Ayin. And what it means is he had bright eyes. So his eyes are a different color. He doesn't have the dark hair and dark complexion. A more fair complexion. A more of a reddish tint to his hair. Maybe even red-headed. And his eyes are a different color. Where am I going with this? Okay, so we can compare that description there with another one let's see if I can find it real quick. Hope I didn't lose. I know I wrote it down here someplace. In 25:3, 1 Samuel 25 verse 3, we see the same phrase used to describe someone named Abigail. And here it says that she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. But the phrase there is Yafet Toar. She had a beautiful, Toar means about her figure, her shape, or her outline. So she had a very beautiful figure. Same phrase in English, totally different meaning in Hebrew. Okay, now, I think that David had a different mother. And I have reason to think that. Okay, if we look in Psalm 51:5, if you want to flip back to Psalms. I should have already had this bookmarked, sorry. But in Psalm 51, David is talking here very briefly about his mother, or about him, And verse 5, 51:5, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. So maybe either Jesse had a mistress, or perhaps his wife passed away. We don't know anything about Jesse's wife. So perhaps she had passed away, and then he had been with somebody else, maybe even someone who was a servant. If it was somebody who was a female servant, or a slave, she very well might have been from another place, somewhere like, what do you think about the area around Lebanon? Okay, Leban, L-E-B, this is the same root as Laban, who we read about in Genesis. And Laban, that name means white. And if you know anything about the Lebanese people, their complexions are much fairer than other parts of the Middle East. Now, I could be wrong about all this, but to me, it's interesting and it makes sense. If David had a different mother, he would have been treated differently, especially by his brothers. And if she were a servant, or if she had been a foreigner of some kind, then especially he would have not had the same social standing as his brothers. And we can compare this to the way that Christ was treated by his brothers. And this is a whole other video, but I think that Jesus' brothers, my opinion, I think that they were older than him and from possibly a different mother. It's a whole thing to get into, but just saying this, if they were, okay, James, for example, his brother didn't believe in him, and if they had grown up in the same house, he as a younger brother, he'd have grown up hearing the stories. He should have believed in who Jesus was. Okay, another video, another time. All right, back to this. So David's been treated differently. I think it would make sense then this is why he was not called, not simply because he's out there with the sheep, but he's really not considered part of the family. Okay, so let's learn a little more about David. So he's anointed to be the king. Remember, keep this in mind, David knows he's anointed to be the king when he goes to fight Goliath. It gives me a little different perspective on David's mindset. Not just that he's faithful to the Lord, but he's going to fight for his people. Okay. But we read on now in Samuel 16, verse 14, it talks about how Saul had the Spirit of the Lord departed him, and he had an evil spirit come. He would get depressed, or maybe he had some kind of mental illness. And so the servants there at Saul's servants say, let's seek out a man who is cunning player on the harp. And it shall pass, when this evil spirit comes upon you, he can play and you'll feel better. And so he says, okay, well, let's do that. And then somebody says, look, I know somebody, a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. So again, Jesse seems to be well known. He's cunning in playing, a mighty valiant man, a man of war, prudent in manners, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Okay, that's in verse 18. So again, the descriptors. He's an excellent musician, a mighty valiant man, a man of war. He's prudent in manners, comely person, and the Lord's with him. So we have 6 descriptors there. Let's look at those real quick. Okay, the Lord's with him, so he's a spiritual person, a comely person. And looking at the Hebrew, he's nice to look at. He's a good-looking guy. He's handsome, prudent in matters. I'm going backwards for a reason. Prudent in matters. He has a lot of wisdom. He can speak well. He's articulate. He's intelligent. And then we get here to a mighty valiant man and a man of war. Okay, a mighty valiant man. When we look at the Hebrew there, Kail, that means, mighty comes from Gabor, means very strong and athletic and just competent. Kail also means strong, forceful, has a lot of ability. So they're doubling up on the adjectives there to describe David. Now remember, David's brother, the oldest, is quite tall. So there's a good chance perhaps that Jesse himself might have been larger than average. But the genetics are there. And I think David was much bigger, not as tall as Saul, but much bigger than the average Israelite. Where it says a man of war. Now, this often throws people off. People assume that there is something incorrect here in the sequence of events, that it's going back and forth. And there was a time when I thought this, until I discovered what this phrase means. And the man of war does not necessarily mean that he's been to war. What it means is that he was a trained and skillful fighter. Now, he certainly was. Shepherds, people keeping livestock, had to be able to defend these livestock. And we know that he defended them against animals, right? But he also had to be able to defend them against robbers, against other people who might want to come and steal some of these sheep. And we can think of other stories, other scriptural stories from Genesis or some from the Book of Mormon where these things would happen. Also, think back to Abraham. Abraham, although the wording's a little different, but Abraham had servants, and some of those were trained. Maybe all the men were trained, and King Chedorlaomer goes and he attacks the city of Sodom, and he carries them all away. And Abraham arms his trained servants. They're trained to fight. He arms them, and they go and they defeat Chedorlaomer. Anyway, so David is a trained fighter, and proven in that, as he'll tell Saul later, he had killed a lion and a bear. So what I'm trying to describe here is David very well might have been the youngest. I think, but I don't know. I'm not convinced he was the youngest. But he's not old enough to go to war. He had to be 19 to go to war. And we'll see in a minute he was not old enough. But he was certainly strong and athletic and knew how to fight. And he's good looking and he's intelligent and he can play the harp. He's a Renaissance man. He has it all going on. Okay, so David comes. They send for him. He comes with some gifts from his dad. And it says in verse 21 that he became Saul's armor bearer. Now, I want to clarify something here. This is not a time of war. So what did the armor bearers do when there was not a war going on? Well, the armor bearers, and it uses it in the singular there. He became his armor bearer. If we read ahead on in Samuel, we see that... Joab. Joab, who's one of the generals, he himself had 10 armor bearers. Well, he didn't have enough armor for 10 people to have to carry it all. But this was a term used to describe their personal servants. Now, did they carry armor? Sure. They would help him put it on and all that stuff. So he becomes one of Saul's personal servants. Now, if Joab had 10, how many do you think the king had? He probably had twice that many or more. But he was not a common servant in the palace or in the home or whatever. He was more of a personal servant, and he would have been one of many. And that's important in a minute. So he became an armor bearer. And then he would play for him. Okay, now let's get on into chapter 17. Things are going to change a little bit. Some time has passed. War was something that would take place at certain times of the year. And it says in 17 verse 1, the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together. That's in verse 2. Down in verse 3, we read that the Philistines on one side of, on a mountain on one side of a valley, and the Israelites are on the other side, and it tells us how Goliath would come out. Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, and there's a lot of people like to debate that. Was he really 9 or 10 feet tall? I don't think it's impossible. But, just think about somebody like Shaquille O'Neal, or somebody even bigger, Andre the Giant. These enormous. Think about, oh my goodness, if you keep up with any of the strongman competition stuff, Hafthor Bjornsson or Brian Shaw from the U.S., those guys are like 6'8", 6'9", and they're both like 450 pounds. I don't know if I'd want to fight. I used to be a cop. Spent 20 years in law enforcement. I'm not afraid to fight. I don't want to fight those guys. He's big. Big man. Big, strong man. Okay. Big enough that he scares the you-know-what out of everybody. So it talks about his helmet of brass, his coat of mail. I won't get into all the weights on those, but these it was huge. His armor was huge. He has greaves of brass. That's armor on his legs. He has a target of brass between his shoulders. That was neck armor. He had a thing around his neck. So all of his vitals will be protected. And this armor was heavy. He talks about the size of his spear. It was huge. And so he's got all this heavy armor, and he has somebody carrying his shield going before him. It's one of the points that Malcolm Gladwell makes to say that Goliath really was not much of a fighter. And I'm going to disagree, because he had been their champion for a long time. He had been fighting for a long time. But he has all this heavy armor, so you have this guy carrying this shield going with him down this mountain. It's okay. I would expect somebody to help him carry something down there, right? And so he comes down and he has his little boasting that he would holler out. And this went on for 40 days and 40 nights. And so now David's back home. Okay, let me stop for a second. I missed a part. I wanted to... Okay. Verse 12. Okay, this is key to show that this is in chronological order. Because David had been with Saul as an armor bearer. But in 17:12, it says, "Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse." Okay. And again, Ephrathite is meant, well, it's the whole thing about places. Ephrathite's kind of interchangeable with Bethlehemite. Okay. Says the three eldest sons of Jesse. We're in verse 13 for a second. The three eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. So the three oldest are at least 19. Now, there were other reasons a person could not have to go fight if somebody had just been married. So there are a few other reasons why. So it could have been there were others that were old enough to go, but didn't. Anyway, but the three oldest are able to go. So Eliab goes, and Abinadab and Shammah. Those three go. And then verse 14 says, David was the youngest, and the three eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Again, where it says David was youngest, and it might very well mean he was the youngest. But it definitely means David was too young. David was the youngest. David was too young to go fight. So these brothers go fight, and it says David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Okay, and then the Philistine draws near, and for 40 days he gives his boasting. Okay, so let's skip ahead a little bit. We're getting closer to the fight. Jesse wants to find out how his sons are doing. How's the war going? Are they still alive? What's going on? And it was also customary, as I understand, for them to provide food for the army. So he sends all this food, sends it with David, and sends David to go find out. So in verse 20, David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper. So they did have people to watch the sheep. So he did as Jesse commanded, and he says when he came to the trench as the host was going forth. So that's not a great translation. He gets to the camp where they're all set up. He gets to the camp as the army's going forth to fight. Verse 22, it says, David left his carriage. He didn't go in a wagon or a carriage. Here, carriage means the stuff he brought with him. So he left all the food and everything he brought. He leaves it in the hand of the keeper of the carriage. So he gives it to the quartermaster. And he runs to the army, and he salutes his brothers. And then here comes Goliath out. So he's going to see for the first time Goliath. And he hears the challenge that Goliath gives. Verse 24 says, back in verse 23, it at the end it says, David heard them. He heard the words that Goliath is speaking. And then it says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. So they all run away. And they're saying, have you seen this man that's come up here? So they're talking to David. Have you seen him? It shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. That last part is going to be key here in a minute. He will make his father's house free in Israel. Remember, David is one of many servants. I doubt that Saul knew him very well personally. Okay, and so David goes around asking, what will be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? And so I guess he's asking because he wants to make sure. And he says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David is displaying his faith, but also, again, he knows he's anointed to become the next king, and he's a little upset that there's nobody in this army that one day he'll be in charge of willing to go and fight. And so that the people, in verse 27, the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done. And they repeat what we already just read. And Eliab hears that he's there, and he gets mad. Why do you come down here? Verse 28, with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? He's talking down to him. He's talking bad about the sheep. He says, I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. You just want to see what's going on. You think you're as big bad, you know how to fight, you just want to come and see. You can't wait to join the army. You should be back home. So there's definitely some conflict, some contention. Plus, they know that he has been anointed, right? So I would expect there would be some jealousy, like we would have seen between Joseph, sold into Egypt, and his brothers. Okay. Now, hang on. David says, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him the same. And so when the people there hear what David has to say, then they go and they tell Saul. And so David tells Saul apparently what he was telling everybody else in verse 32. David says to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. He says, I'll go fight. Again, David, although he's not been in the army, he certainly looks the part. And Saul says to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. So apparently Goliath has been fighting a long time. Saul knows that David's too young to fight. He's thinking about the experience of fighting in war, in battle. And so then David tells Saul why he's not afraid. I'm going to tell you, if I had had this experience, I wouldn't be afraid either. Thy servant kept his father's sheep. We're in verse 34. And there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. I'm assuming that's one of the two. I would say it's probably the bear first. And when he arose against me, this is going to be the lion probably, I caught him by the beard and smote him and slew him, because bears don't have a beard, but the lion does. What did he kill him with? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this now. shepherds had three things with them that could be used as a weapon. They had their sling. We know that David uses the sling coming up. They had their big staff. Sometimes had a crook at the end. These would be a 5 or 6 foot tall, heavy piece of wood. Read a little bit of the stories of Robin Hood, the real stories, and the description in there of how those are used as weapons is pretty incredible. This was more effective than a sword. A sword had no chance against a staff. Staff would break it in half. Anyway, so this could be used for different things, but also as a weapon. But they also carried a rod. Now think about 23rd Psalm. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Okay. A rod's kind of like a nightstick that you would see a cop carry. It was a club, maybe a couple of feet long, 1.5 feet, 2 feet long, made out of oak or some other hard, dense wood. And on the end, the one end would have been made from a part where there's a big knot or something. It had been extra hard. And sometimes there were pieces of metal or something stuck in there to make it even more useful. And when it says he grabs him by the beard and smote him and killed him, he beat a lion to death with a club. He's not afraid of Goliath. One of the things you learn in sports, it's all about matchups, right? And this is going to be about matchups here. I'm a big boxing fan. I love boxing. I love MMA. Go back and look at a fight between Jack Dempsey, who, by the way, was, although not active in practicing his religion, was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Go back and look at Jack Dempsey when he won the heavyweight championship. He weighed maybe 180 pounds. And he fought Jess Willard, who was just this great big mountain of a man, much bigger. And this is how I envision this fight kind of unfolding. You have this guy who's really more of a light heavyweight going up against this great big massive heavyweight. And it's just not a fair fight for Goliath. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So he says, thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. I killed a lion. I killed a bear. I'm not afraid of this man. He says, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. So, not only does he know that he has the skill, but he knows that the Lord will be with him and he will be protected. So then Saul puts his armor on David. Now I want you to think about this for a second. Why Saul's armor? Saul was a big man. This is a part of the reason why I think that David was big. He was big and strong. Not just because of the description, but you have a whole army of people. He could have chosen anyone's armor, but he put his own. I think probably because it's the armor that would have fit him the best. But now David's not used to wearing armor. And so I can understand. I'll just tell you a quick story of my days when I was in law enforcement. And I had been with a previous department. I had been on SWAT and had worked with as a SWAT officer. And so I went to this new department, and they didn't have a SWAT team, and they wanted to start one, so we started one up. And we went through all the training and everything, and then our boss decided that we would have as realistic an exercise as we could come up with. And to kind of show, to gauge how much these guys had learned. And having been on SWAT previously, I had used and had been used to using the big, heavy, armor-plated, these big, heavy shields. And we had one, and the other guys, they didn't like to train with it. They didn't like it. They weren't used to it. And so we had this kind of a call-out, this incident to judge. And we're having to approach this building at distance, and we have no cover. And all of a sudden, they're like, the shield's really important. But nobody's used to it. I was used to it. I carried it. So I led out, and everybody behind me, we went in. We got the bad guy. But the point is, David's not used to wearing all that armor. He doesn't know how to use it properly. He's not used to fighting with it on. Tactics are a lot different. So he says he put his armor on David. He put a helmet of brass on his head and armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go. That means he went walking around. He's trying to test it out, and he didn't like it. He had not proved it. He had never used it before. So David says to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off. So he takes the weapons he's used to. Again, this is about matchups. Of course, the Lord is on his side. That's the most important part. However, there are also these matchups. Okay. He takes his staff in his hand. He goes down to the brook. He gets 5 smooth stones, puts them in a shepherd's bag, and has his sling. Now, he also would have had his rod would have been hanging from his belt. So he had probably the sling on one side and this rod on the other. And so the Philistine comes out to draw near. The man that's holding the shield is going before him. It's this guy's job to kind of, in case, I guess, an arrow comes or something, but he's got this out there in front of him. Or maybe he's just carrying it. So Malcolm Gladwell uses these points coming up to show that Goliath couldn't walk well. He was just a big, clumsy guy. He had double vision. He couldn't see very well. But I disagree. I think he could see and all just fine. I think just the idea of having all this weight that he's carrying, plus the shield to go down this mountain to then fight with somebody. Well, let's not tire him out completely before he gets down there. Okay, verse 43, he says, the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? This is the point that Malcolm Gladwell likes to make, saying that he had double vision. Okay, he didn't have double vision. Staves, the word there in Hebrew, it means a piece of wood or a stick. He got sticks. Yes, it's plural, because he has his staff and he has the rod. And then he says to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and unto the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. I just love that. This absolute faith and confidence in the Lord, but also because he has gone to battle against these animals, a lion and a bear before. So we know the story from this point, right? Goliath comes up, comes close to David. David runs at him, takes a stone, puts it in his sling, and slings it. A sling can throw a rock really fast. So he's got. Oh, and also, the speed and size of the stones they typically used, they say would carry about the same energy as a .44 Magnum would have being shot. So That's how deadly a weapon a sling is. So he takes this sling, he slings the stone, and it hits him right in the forehead and sinks into his head, and down he goes. Okay. It says, therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword. So Goliath has this giant sword. David is strong enough to use this sword. In fact, he used it in war later. He stood upon the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath and slew him and cut off his head. And when they saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The Philistines fled. So again, David's not a little kid. He's strong. He's not as big as Goliath, but he's strong. He's big. He has won fights against a lion and against a bear, and he wins here. And he had faith in God that he would do so. So we know from reading a little earlier in the description of David, he says, it's on the previous page, in chapter 16, verse 18, the Lord is with him. So he was also a spiritual person. And there's a talk I've given a couple of times, and maybe I'll give it on here sometime, about David and this whole spiritual side, about how he was prepared his whole life to face Goliath, and about how we can prepare like David did to face the Goliaths in our lives. But that's not the point today. And I want to mention one other thing here before I go. Couple of things here further down in chapter 17. So David in chapter 50. I'm sorry, I'm getting tired already. Verse 53. So they spoil the tents of the Philistines. Verse 54. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. And he put his armor in his tent, Goliath's armor. He takes Goliath's head and all of his armor. Okay. And then in verse 55, when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Abner, whose son is this youth? Now, some use this phrase to show, again, their belief that this is all out of order, but I don't think so. Again, he would have been one of many servants there, and so Saul needs to know who David's father is, and he probably doesn't remember. He'd been told, who knows how long previously, but it just didn't come up again. There's a lot of people around, right? So he doesn't say, who is he? He says, whose son is he? Why? Because of the promise that he had made to free his father's house in Israel. So if he's going to send a decree that this man, that David's father, that he and all, his whole household are going to be free from taxes and from military service and other things, then he needs to know who the father is. So that's why he's asking. He's asking, who is his father? And then Abner says, I don't know. And this is really cool in verse 56. See if this doesn't strike a familiar chord. The king said, inquire thou whose son the stripling is. Have you heard that word before? I don't know how many times I had read this story. And then one day, all of a sudden, boom, that stands out. Stripling. Inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And if you look at the footnote, if you have the version of the Bible It's the King James Version, but the one with the footnotes printed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then you'll see down here the footnote, Hebrew for young man. And the actual Hebrew word is Elam. Huh. That just makes me wonder, makes me think. I don't know that there's a connection, but Elam, and I don't know. Stripling warriors. It's a cool connection, no matter what. All right, y'all. That's all I've got for now. But so I hope maybe you learned something. And I'm not doing this to brag on myself. I hope to inspire you to fall in love with studying the scriptures, because I absolutely have. I love it. All right, I'm going to go. See y'all again soon. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll try to address those as I can. And see y'all later.